First of all, thank you for those amazing readings. I get kind of nervous, so I got a little tangled up on the names, but didn't get nervous when I accepted your poems. And you read, some of the ones that we picked, and they deal with hard issues from your lens. They're unfiltered and they're represent a version of truth, an important one. So I'm going to frame two questions that I think in the limited time we have left. I'd just like to go through those two, and I'll frame it with this. You all are inspired by experience of crossing cultural borders, geographic borders, borders between languages, borders between cultures, borders between the present and the past. And within those borders, there's a lot of conflict, a lot of pain. And I have two ways that I want to talk about it. We'll go to the micro about how you write, to the more macro in terms of the impact that it might have on the viewers. So the first part is about translation. DM is writing in 3 languages, basically, in his mind. He has 3 different ways that he can write, and he's living here. Lena has 2, plus she's fluent in a 3rd, but not to speak it, I guess, academically. So she almost has 3. Kirun also is dealing with cultures. And sometimes translation is not only in the language, it's understanding the nuances of culture. It's understanding how to get under the skin and into the community so other people can understand it. So what I wonder is, when you're thinking about these borders, these languages, when you're writing, I have just a couple of questions about translating. Does anything get lost in translation? When you're trying to do this, how do you deal with that? How do you try to bridge, let's say, maybe the inadequacy of language, which is hard enough when you don't have to do all this extra, right? And then the second thing is there something in particular that you find, and if you have any examples in your work that we could go real quickly, that where you're addressing these problems and maybe talking about maybe a difference if you're going from particularly one that you consider your home language to another, or a home culture to another, versus when you're going from another back into the language that you feel most comfortable with. So I'll throw it out to anybody who wants to address that, and you can bring up any of the work, or if you have a poem or part of one that you have in front of you that you would want to refer to, a moment in it or something that would illustrate a potential issue that you wrestle with.
Well, maybe I'll jump in on the first part of what you asked about how you deal with what's lost in translation. I think, there is certainly no way to bring things across exactly. But I often think of translation as a sort of sensation where the original lives inside this box, and each translation is like a little window, a little hole that you can peer through inside, and through that translation you see one view of that original, and it's not the total of it, but it is this amazing window that opens for you through that one translation. And in that sense, the translator's job isn't to bring across everything, right? The translator's job is to create one window through which that original mystery can be experienced and perceived, and that the original in that sense gets to preserve its mystery, which is something that I find a more powerful way, a more exciting way to think of translation than to think of it in terms of what's lost. The other part I would just say about sort of losing and finding, is that it's interesting that we focus so much on what's lost. And, it comes back to maybe, certainly in the West, the sense that from the Bible, we get the story of Babel, right? That we all speak different languages is a punishment. But in that sense, translation becomes this wonderful act of resistance, right? Where you can say that no matter what culture separates us, no matter how many centuries separate us, even if God separates us, right, we can speak to each other, imperfectly maybe, partially maybe, but we can reach across through translation and find each other.
I really love that image of the box, Kirun, with the different sort of little points of light where you're looking and seeing some version of the whole. I just find that really perfect for my experience of translation. Right now, I'm actually working on a translation of a novella, which is new for me. I've only really focused on poetry for the most part in the past, the exception of the screenplay. And it's a novella by a Palestinian poet and novelist, Maya Abul Hayat. And one of the things that has been so refreshing in this experience is how many different versions of myself I get to discover, right? Because I'm carrying it over from the Arabic into the English. And so the first take, I feel very much like an Arabic speaker, an Arab, like dutifully carrying it over in like super accurate English. And then, the next iteration, there's a part of my brain that's maybe somewhere between those two cultures that's, kind of refining. And then there's a very editorial, like deeply American version of me and so apparently there's like a whole host of people in there. And, we normally introduce ourselves in these narrow terms, but it made me reflect on how she is also a complex person, this writer, with all different sort of iterations and versions of her identity. And so in that way, translation is an invitation to really broaden how we think of one another and ourselves, I think, beyond kind of the narrow confines of prescribed identity.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that, Lena. I mean, I'm not like I haven't done a lot of translation. And so, just, hearing you guys and other things I've learned, I think it's very good because for me personally, as I mentioned earlier on before the show started, translation goes beyond language for me. I think about, translating experience. And now, when Ron mentioned what's lost, and sometimes I think about how, as someone coming from this part of the world where, especially poetry is not as widely accepted in America, so to say, and our sensibilities. So, I think about how, to translate this experience, at least for me and, for my people and to my own satisfaction. But it's pretty difficult because of how, provincial American literature is and how, things are approached. So for me, translation is all about experience and how I'm able to translate what I'm thinking about in my first language, Yoruba, or what I'm thinking about in my second language, Pidgin. And how I, think about this, because when I think creatively, I think about these things in Yoruba and English and Pidgin, sorry, but I write it down in English. So this first process of translation for me, I'm translating my ideas and my, my thinking. So that's how translation works for me. And, in terms of what's lost, yeah, some things are lost because there are like no direct English words for some of the things we have in Yoruba and some of the things that we have in Pidgin. So, sometimes, yeah, it definitely gets lost there. I mean, yeah. Thank you.
Well, let me, if I could follow up a little bit with the idea, you wanted to go to the positive side, which is a good thing, but I'm still concerned because what I've learned in the 40 plus years up in Alaska, I've looked what's happened with the indigenous cultures here. When in fact, people who did not understand the culture, even if they were well-intentioned and thought they understood it, would do the translations, and that actually became the story because it wasn't done with either the knowledge or the cultural sensitivity. I wondered if you could, respond to that. I mean, because it really doesn't it matter who is doing the translating and what their lens is as well as what their ability is, because I've seen it firsthand what the damage it did to the stories of, say, Alaska Native people when things were mistranslated, and then even again mistranslated. In other words, the original thing that supposedly was the original text was not at all original, right? It was just the first thing that somebody put into English. And then it got even further away from it, almost like a game of telephone. So I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, because I think translation is not only an art, as does the National Endowment for the Arts. So in other words, if you're translating poetry, prose, you're doing art. I mean, so now you even have to do something else. You're not going just A to B, then you have to get all those beautiful nuances of culture. So I just wondered, just to make it harder, what do you do to ensure, particularly if it's not your home language, to make sure that there isn't that kind of mistake made? And I'll just add one other thing. Misunderstandings between people. You talked about how babble and everybody can talk to each other. Well, how many fights are because how somebody takes a word? A word has so much meaning to them. And the other person is not sensitive to the meaning of that word. And boom. So, I mean, since all of you write without any filter, you're brave and courageous, which is, you're really dealing with things. This has to be a serious concern, right? When you're doing anything to do with, we'll even say translating experience, as opposed to even just translating the literal words.
I mean, it's an interesting issue that you raised, Ron. The way I'm hearing what you're raising is a question about power. And I think that that's a really important dynamic in translation. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that each of us is translating a language that is our own, from one, like, I don't think any of us are approaching a language we don't actually speak or live in to some degree. And so when you bring up the story of the Native cultures that have been misrepresented, the thing that it raises in my mind is who was doing those translations and what were they doing it for? And so there's a kind of maybe like a cultural tourism approach that maybe was, I'm hoping is less pervasive now than perhaps in times in the past, but we know now, that's a kind of violence and theft even of culture. And so, yeah, I can't imagine, I can't imagine the harm that must cause, not addressing that power dynamic.
Do you all feel the same? I mean, do you feel totally comfortable with translating the different levels of experience between things?
Yeah, for me, definitely. I mean, the poem I read, written in Pidgin, I also, have it in English sonnets, and I, why translating it back to Pidgin, because I wrote it in Pidgin first, and then, translated it to English and then back to Pidgin, some words in that, like, you can't just find some English words in Pidgin, and I just feel comfortable, having like the words that I think are like closest, in terms of like what I'm trying to pass across, because I feel like, the experience that I'm trying to translate is still the same thing, or it's kind of approximate to, what I have in English. And since I know both language, and since it's kind of the story I'm telling is sort of like, my country's story, I feel confident about that. So in terms of that, I think, yeah.
Kirun?
Well, I would say I feel I feel uncomfortable with all writing, and worry about how well I'm approaching what I intend to say or should say, even in English or in anything. I think writing is just hard, and you always have to be thinking about power and the way that your words represent you and your experience and others and those who hear what you're saying. So I certainly think that that's an important thing to think about. In terms of translation, I would say, there are lots of translators who work and translate from languages they don't speak themselves. And I think, in those situations, the best thing is to be humble, right? And to know that you're bringing one piece of the puzzle to that process. And that for the other pieces, you need to seek out others, right? So you might work with a scholar of that language or a native speaker of that language or several scholars and native speakers of that language. And in the mix between all of you, you'll come to a translation which will not be the perfect translation, right? Some other translator and some other groups of people will come up with a slightly different one. I think my hope is always that when I work on a piece of translation, that I will not be the only person to translate it, and that others will come after me and they will open a different window to that original. And that I have to remember that no matter, even if it's a language I know really well or a language I don't know really well, I will not be bringing its full glory across, its full mystery across. I don't think that we can do that in translation. Maybe we can't even do that in our own poems. I don't know. I think starting from a place of deep humility, and asking and seeking and looking to undo those imbalances of power where we find them, is the approach I try to take.
That makes sense. And this goes to the idea of translating experience as opposed to the words, which you do in your poems. That's exactly what you're doing. And as we know, poetry has tremendous power, and the arts are incredibly underrated for how important they are. And so I started with the idea of crossing all these borders of all the different kinds. And now, I think one of the powers of arts, all arts, but very, very important in the literary arts, is the idea of creating empathy and compassion. It's creating empathy and compassion through truth. And truth is messy, and truth is different from the different angles of people seeing it. It's not always this, same thing, same event, different truth depending on the angle that you're looking at it. So, I'd like to end on this because all three of you are really courageous writers, poets, and I admire you, and I'm so grateful that you were willing to come on. I want to ask you how you seek to build empathy when you are addressing, and actually you are addressing diverse cultures, even if you speak the language, because there are nuances of things even within. I'm not saying, Lena, that I'm not commenting on that specifically, but I think even within groups, there are divisions. Mm-hmm. And so how do you seek to build empathy across diverse cultures and experiences? How do you seek to, Kirun, we took a very, very powerful poem of yours, right? And put it in. It's not easy to listen to. It's impossible to ignore, however, as what people do. You put us there and you made us look at it. It's a kind of way that you can experience something and be in shoes. On the other hand, we need to, in an increasingly polarized world where things are, it's getting worse and worse everywhere, almost on every level. And so in my mind, the arts are in some ways the only hope. They are the only hope, because if we talk to each other, like you said, everybody can communicate. What kind of talk is the talk that's going to actually bridge these gaps and go to the heart, right? And you can think right away, well, music does that. Visual art does that. Dance does that. And of course, poetry and prose do that when they are in the artistic context. So how do you do it? What's your take on it? We only have a minute or so, but it is something that I think for courageous writers, it's something that I know it's something you'd want to do. I mean, I think that's where you change people. I mean, as literature teachers and creative writing teachers, you know, when people read something that's really powerful and they're in the shoes, it changes their world. They go, oh, now I know what that feels like, right? I mean, so just dive in and we'll conclude it. You know, nothing fluff with our end conversation, all hard stuff. Whoever wants to start, and then just go as you see. None of you want to start? How you aim for empathy? Have you given up on empathy and compassion? You haven't, right? It's just a hard question, isn't it? Well, Michael, you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, personally, I just hope that I create like when I write poems, and when I write my poems are populated with people, real people. I just hope that I'm able to write about and create a character that I'm able to humanize my characters in a way that like other people will be able to see them as human beings, just not caricatures, and be able to relate to their experiences and things like that. I mean, you've said it, on literature helps us to kind of step into good literature, helps us to step into the mind of another human being, right? So which if that's what I hope to be able to achieve by just write my poems and create humanize my characters, as I mentioned. And I just hope that the reader would also be open to this and be willing, right, to step into this the mind of this these characters, or this human being, this poet who is creating these poems. So yeah, that's the best I can just say. Yeah.
Lena or Kirun, do you want to add anything to that? You just muted yourself. There you go. It's perfect.
Okay, sorry. I don't know if I've given up on empathy. It's hard now. I tend to agree with your assessment of how the world looks. The poets I return to for comfort are ones that just say the thing as it is, and the poetic sort of majesty of their work is in its directness and in its unsparing honesty. So when times are really rough, I turn to poets like June Jordan, and I don't know a poet who's more direct in her magnificent address. I feel like when I'm reading, like she's looking me right in my eyes. And so I hold that as a goal for myself. I think I'm not a fan of the American notion of both sides and different. I kind of don't like, I feel like, the goal is to try to be as honest as humanly possible. There's nothing more poetic than that. And on the rare occasion that I feel like I've made a good attempt, I feel like those poems are the ones that have found their readers. I don't know. I hope that answers your question.
Well, that makes sense, what you just said. Kirun?
It's a hard question to answer. I think when I talk to my students about writing, what I often end up saying to them is, what are the bodies doing? What are the bodies doing in the poem? And, I think less about trying to create empathy than trying to tell what it's like from the inside of the body, I think. And from there, I think other people can enter. We all have bodies, right? The mystery of our existence is that we are all incarnate here. That is something that we share and something that we can enter into immediately, and is what makes the poem alive and embodied and places the reader inside the poem, no matter how far their personal experience might be from the subject of the poem. So I think I try to make that question of empathy very granular. And it comes down to, right, what are the hands doing and how do they feel, right? What is the light like against the face? And find that empathy, if it's going to arise in a poem, it starts there, sort of rather than from a larger or more abstract question that I might have.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. And I wasn't suggesting that it has to be external or that you think about it, but ultimately that's what when it's working, when it ultimately has its power, that's what it does. It has to be authentic. And I agree with you, Lena, there are some things that don't have two sides. So, Charlottesville in the US, that did not have two sides, in my opinion. There were no two sides to that. It was very clear that that was one side. But sometimes there are multiple sides to a kind of truth. It's very messy. And somehow, if the arts could get inside of those people of goodwill, by the way, not everybody has goodwill, right? I mean, but people of goodwill, if you could be inside and show the empathy, make it real. What's the body doing? As you just said, might get to a better place.